Well, good morning or afternoon for both men's and women's community Bible study. It seems like it's been forever since we met in person, and indeed that is true. But it also feels like forever since I did a lesson, and so I'm delighted to be back with you. We're going to spend the next several months, whether it's on video or in person, in the book of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Let me just add that it is the desire of many to start back meeting, and we are trying to find a place that is big enough for most of us to return and still social distance. So until we can find such a place, we will continue to do it online. So here we are, looking at the book first of First Thessalonians. Now, First Thessalonians, along with perhaps Galatians, is Paul's first book, first or second book, and it is certainly those two books, Galatians and First Thessalonians, are the earliest New Testament books written. The book itself comes to us from the pen of Paul along with Silas and his traveling companion Timothy, and it was written to the church at Thessalonica from Corinth. Paul was on his second missionary journey, going on to visit and plant new churches, and so we're probably somewhere in the year 50 to 51, probably 51 AD. Now, the book of Acts, chapters 16 and 17, gives us the story of this particular section of Paul's second missionary journey. It tells us how he got to Thessalonica. You might remember he was planning to go to Asia and was prevented, it says, by the Spirit from going into Asia. And one night in a dream, he sees a man from Macedonia calling out for him to come over and preach there in Macedonia. And so Paul then changes his plans and goes to Macedonia. He and Silas and Timothy travel there, and they first arrive in Philippi and plant the church there that we know as the church at Philippi, the book of Philippians written to them. Then from Philippi, they would journey on to Thessalonica, actually having left Philippi due to unrest there over their teaching. Now, Thessalonica was the capital of the Macedonian Roman province. Macedonia was a Roman province, and Thessalonica there, its capital. It was established in probably 315, 316 BC, and was renamed after Alexander the Great's half-sister. Now, just from a geography standpoint, we are in the northern part of what we would know today as Greece. Now, Paul, as is his usual custom as we read of his missionary journeys, he first goes to the synagogue and teaches and preaches there. But eventually they will establish a house church. The church there in Thessalonica, the young church, was made up of some Jewish converts, but mainly from Gentiles and not a few prominent women there in the town. That probably took several weeks to get that church established. After they leave there and move on from Thessalonica, as you would follow along in Acts 17, they go from there to Berea, and eventually Paul makes his way to Athens. Now, in Athens, he will send back Timothy to the church at Thessalonica because they didn't spend as long there as they would have liked to check on the church, to see how it's going, to encourage the church there, and to get a report for Paul so that he might know how the church is faring. Timothy would eventually return to Paul. Paul has now moved from Athens on to Corinth when Timothy catches up with him. And Timothy makes his report to Paul and to Silas. And then Paul, Silas, and Timothy pen, probably mostly Paul, pen this letter back to the church at Thessalonica. And we would know that letter that Paul sends from Corinth as indeed 1 Thessalonians. Now, to get an overview of the book, I want you to watch this brief, just a few minutes video that gives a beautiful overview of 1 Thessalonians. And then we will, in the weeks ahead, break down verse by verse, as is our norm, as we go through the book. So I hope you enjoy this video of an overview of 1 Thessalonians.
Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians. This is most likely the earliest letter that we have from Paul, and the backstory for it is found in the book of Acts. It's where Paul and his co-worker Silas went to the ancient Greek city of Thessalonica. And after just 1 month of telling people the good news about Jesus, a large number of Jewish and Greek people gave their allegiance to Jesus, and they formed the first church community there. But trouble was brewing. Paul's announcement of the risen Jesus as the true Lord of the world, it led to suspicion. So the Christians in Thessalonica were eventually accused of defying Caesar, the Roman emperor, when they said that there is another king, Jesus. And this led to a persecution that got so intense, Paul and Silas actually had to flee from the city, and this was painful for them because they loved the people there so much. And so this letter is Paul's attempt to reconnect with the Christians in Thessalonica after he got a report from Timothy that they were doing more than okay. They were flourishing despite this intense persecution. He designed the letter to have two main movements. First is a celebration of their faithfulness to Jesus, and then he challenges them to keep growing as followers of Jesus. And then these two movements are surrounded by three prayers. The letter opens with a thanksgiving prayer. The two movements are linked together by a transitional prayer, and then the whole thing is concluded with a final prayer. It's a beautiful design. Paul opens by giving thanks and celebrating the Thessalonians' faith, their love for others, and their hope in Jesus despite persecution. He goes on to retell the story of their conversion, how they used to be idolatrous polytheists, and they were living in a culture where all of life was permeated by institutions and practices that honored the Greek and Roman gods. And Paul talks about how they turned away from those idols to serve the living and true God, and that they're now waiting for the coming of God's Son from heaven. So in a city like Thessalonica, transferring your allegiance to the Creator God of Israel and to King Jesus, this came at a cost. Isolation from your neighbors, hostility from your family. But for the Thessalonians, the overwhelming love of Jesus who died for them and the hope of his return, it made it all worth it. Paul then retells the story of his mission in Thessalonica and of the dear friendships he formed with the people. He uses really intimate metaphors here. They treated him like their child, and he became like their mother and like their father. He says, "We were happy to share with you not only the good news from God, but our very selves, because we came to dearly love you." Paul reminds us here that the essence of Christian leadership is not about power and having influence. It's about healthy relationships and humble, loving service. He reminds them that he never asked for money. He simply came to love and serve them in the name of Jesus. And so Paul moves on to reflect on their common persecution. Just like Jesus was rejected and killed by his own people, so now Paul is persecuted by his fellow Jews, and the Thessalonians are facing hostility from their Greek neighbors. And Paul draws a strange comfort from knowing that together their sufferings are a way of participating in the story of Jesus' own life and death. Paul then shares about the anguish he experienced when he heard of the hardships the Thessalonians had after he and Silas fled. So he sent Timothy to support them and see how they were doing. And to his joy, Timothy discovered that they were going strong. They were faithful to Jesus. They were full of love for God and their neighbors. And they longed to see Paul as much as he longed to see them. And so Paul concludes with a prayer for endurance. And what's cool is that he introduces here the topics he's going to address in the letter's second half. He prays that God will grow their capacity to love, that he'll strengthen their commitment to holiness as they fix their hope on the return of King Jesus. So he opens the letter's second movement by challenging them to a life that's consistent with the teachings of Jesus. So this means, first of all, a serious commitment to holiness and sexual purity. In contrast to the promiscuous, sexually destructive culture around them, they are to follow Jesus' teaching about experiencing the beauty and the power of sex within the haven of a committed marriage covenant relationship. God takes sexual misbehavior seriously, Paul says. It dishonors and destroys people and their dignity. Following Jesus also means a commitment to loving and serving others. So Paul instructs them that Christians should be known in the city as reliable people who work really hard, not just to make money, but so that they can have resources to provide for themselves and to generously share with people who are in need. After this, Paul addresses a number of questions the Thessalonians had raised about the future hope of Jesus' return. So some Christians in the church had recently died, most likely killed as martyrs, and their friends and family are wondering about their fate when Jesus returns. And so Paul makes it clear that despite their grief and loss, not even death can separate Christians from the love of Jesus. When he returns as king, he will call both the living and the dead to himself. And Paul uses a really cool image here. He uses language that would normally describe how a city subject to the Roman Caesar would send out a delegation to welcome or meet his arrival. Paul then applies this imagery to the arrival of King Jesus. He too will be greeted by a delegation of his people who will go to meet the Lord in the air as they welcome and escort him back to this world where he'll establish his kingdom of justice and peace. Paul then wants the Thessalonians to see how this hope should motivate faithfulness to Jesus. So he pokes fun at the famous Roman propaganda that it's Caesar who brings peace and security. Of course, Rome's peace came through violence, through enslaving their enemies, and military occupation. And Paul warns that Jesus will return as king one day and confront this kind of injustice. Followers of King Jesus should live in the present as if that future day is already here. Despite the nighttime of human evil around them, they should stay sober and awake as the light of God's kingdom dawns here on earth as it is in heaven. Paul closes all of these exhortations like he began, with a hopeful prayer, that God would permeate their lives with his holiness, that he would set them apart to be completely devoted and blameless until the return of King Jesus. 1 Thessalonians reminds us that from the very beginning, following Jesus as king has produced a truly countercultural or holy way of life. And this will sometimes generate suspicion and conflict among our neighbors. But the response of Jesus' followers to such hostility should always be love, meeting opposition with grace and generosity. And this way of life, it's motivated by hope in the coming kingdom of Jesus that has already begun in his resurrection from the dead. And so holiness, love, and future hope, that's what 1 Thessalonians is all about.
So, as you saw from that brief video of an overview, 1 Thessalonians is a very pastoral book full of great tenderness and care. There's no great doctrinal sections of long teaching within the book. It is just a helpful, encouraging book to any believer. And that's why I'm excited to begin this study, because I think we're living in times where we need to be encouraged in the hope of being in Jesus, in Christ, living holy lives. So I look forward to walking through 1 Thessalonians with you in the days ahead, and we look forward to having you join us at least online and perhaps at some point in person. God bless you all.